Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Jennifer McCollum. I'll tell you all about Jennifer in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. And when you do it from a leadership position, as you will definitely discover that Jennifer is, you do it with a reason of bringing people together for common cause, common purpose. Welcome, Jennifer McCollum.
John Baldoni, it's such a pleasure to see you again.
Great. Jennifer is the CEO of Linkage, which is now a subsidiary or entity of the SHRM company. It's a premier leadership development firm. I've known about it forever. And Jennifer has been CEO for 4 years now, something like that. And she has a brand new book called In Her Own Voice, which we're going to talk about today because it's got some really key insights for our time right now, this moment. And it's a welcome to you, Jennifer. And by the way, this book is selling like hotcakes because I see it everywhere, all over social media. So Jennifer, you are making an impact even before people have fully read it cover to cover, which they will do. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much, John. And thanks for honoring the book as well. It's been a labor of love for 18 months now, so it's great for it to be in the world.
Great. Well, the book grabbed me right away because you got an endorsement or the foreword by Johnny C. Taylor, who is the president and CEO of SHRM. And he writes in the foreword that now is the time for this book. And you say the same thing. So in the wake of our pandemic, so why, in her own voice, why is it particularly important for this book, Jennifer?
Yeah. So the book is In Her Own Voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO. And the reason I talk about that kind of secondary title is because A Woman's Rise to CEO is my story, but it's meant to be an aspirational calling for any woman who aspires to advance in her career, whatever career that looks like, and for any leader, man or woman, who aspires to support her. And the reason it's so important, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say it is your story, but in a way, I'm going to say this. I don't know if anyone else is, but you almost hide your story because I'm looking forward. I go, wait, where's the Jennifer story? Well, it's woven throughout, and there's so many other stories of other women leaders or successful leaders that you weave in. So this book is, yes, in your own voice, but it really reflects the voices and experiences of many, which to me makes the book all the more powerful. So give yourself a pat on the back, or I'll give you a pat on the back.
Well, and thank you for saying that. And that kind of answers the original question of why this book and why now. So you are right. It is not the Jennifer autobiography, because as fascinating as I might think that is, that's not the point of the book. The point is the work that we have been doing at Linkage for the last 25 years is to really surface the data and the insight and the development and the experience of what is happening in the world of women's leadership, of gender equity, and frankly, all leadership as they become more inclusive for all populations, including women and other underrepresented populations. What was fascinating in the COVID and post-COVID era is how things changed, how the expectations of what effective leadership is changed. And we saw that in our data. The unique value that women bring aligned to those evolving expectations of leadership. And importantly, and really what this book is grounded in, is what the challenges uniquely that women face on their rise to leadership has been persistent for decades and generations, but the awareness and the urgency around overcoming those challenges has become a lot more evident.
I think you're right. And there was some research done by an author of, I'm blanking out on her name, but How Women Rise. And she's a reporter for MSNBC or CNBC. And she said that women prospered as leaders better than men. Guess why? Because they're not afraid to ask for help. And comment on that willingness to share and to learn from others.
Yeah, and I think Sally Helgeson is the How Women Rise. And I think you're talking about, I think her name was Julia, who wrote a book recently. And there have been a couple cuts at this really leveraging kind of the experiences and surveys of women themselves. What is unique, I think, about what Linkage has done, to answer your question, is we've been studying leadership, and I mentioned the evolving expectations of leadership, and words that you would never have used pre-pandemic to describe the most effective leaders. Words like vulnerability, transparency, authenticity, inclusion, words that were required in a pandemic period when nobody knew the answers and nobody knew how to engage appropriately to figure it out. And so these models of leadership and these outdated perceptions of command and control, competitive, ambitious, driven is kind of the words we might have used before the pandemic started to surface, not only in, looking at leaders who were operating well under the pandemic times versus not well, but also looking at data of looking at 360 feedback. What we call the inclusive leadership behaviors started to really rise to the surface. And women, when we look at our data, women by and large spike more highly than men, as evidenced by their own reflections, but more importantly, the perception of their direct reports, of their managers, and of their peers.
And as you were saying, I said, and we deserve a good shout out to Frances Hesselbein, who was preaching that throughout her very long life as the CEO of the Girl Scouts. And she talked about the circular leadership or circular management, where everyone's in this. And that is a particular women's point of view. Now, here's the downside, or the other side. You talk at length in the book about the inner critic. So is there a difference between a male inner critic and a woman's inner critic? So
Yeah. Yes. And I'm glad you started with what we call the inner critic. It is not a term that Linkage coined, but we've been using it for the last couple of decades. And it represents something that all of us have across the spectrum of gender. And it's that voice of judgment. And the voice of judgment is critical of ourselves. It also can be critical of others. So while everyone has one, for women, that voice is louder. And that voice can potentially shut us down and stop us from achieving our aspirations or our dreams. And just to get super specific, it sounds something like this: I'm not good enough. Um, I shouldn't ask for that job, promotion, raise. I'm not ready. And that voice, and I can tell you some personal stories about how that surfaced for me. That voice can be quieted and calmed. And we talk in the book about how to do that. But to answer your question, we all have one. It's louder for women and it can prevent us from taking action.
right, and again, you had mentioned Sally Helgeson's book, How Women Rise, and her newest, Rising Together, and she talks a lot about, my words and paraphrasing, whatever, women self-sabotaging because they're willing to step back, whereas that's not usually an issue for men. So that's part of the inner critic too, is it not, Jennifer? So.
It is, and this might be appropriate for the personal story I was going to tell you about. So self-sabotage for me, as of 5.5 years ago, when I was considering stepping up to be the CEO of Linkage, when the headhunter called me, my inner critic just kind of blew up very quickly. And it sounded like this: you're not ready to be a CEO. You need to be a number 2 first and be properly groomed. Or what do you know about running a P&L from the revenue line all the way to the EBITDA or the net income line? You've never done that in a publicly traded company. You're restricted to the gross margin line. Or my favorite was, what kind of mother would take a job that would leave her elementary, middle school, and high school age kid and commute to Boston every week or two? They need you. You cannot be a good mother if. And so that inner critic was very, very loud. And that would have been self-sabotaging, to use my good friend Sally's words, except really important people in my network. They happened to be men. They were allies of mine. They were peers of mine, came to me and said, Jennifer, why do we think we're ready to take a private equity-backed portfolio CEO job, but you don't think you're ready? Like, if you don't do this now, when will you ever do this? And it took that allyship to kind of wake me up from that self-sabotage. And that helped me to quiet that inner critic.
And that's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. And boy, what a job did you step into? Because as you're rocking along, and that's where I got to know you, because we met just before the pandemic hit. And I
Whew.
remember you going through this, the challenges that you were facing, and how do I keep our team focused, and all of these things. And then I think you came to the acquaintance of Alan Mullally. So tell us that story.
So I'm so glad you mentioned our friend Alan. And Alan offers a couple examples just to connect it back to the hurdles women face and to the book. The two hurdles women face are making the ask. And making the ask is one of the top three hurdles women face. And the other hurdle is networking. So I'll just talk about those two in the context of Alan. So women by and large tend to do a good job networking. I call it curating a network. By and I'd hate to stereotype, but in general, we're very relationally focused. Women often are very willing to give to the network, where they're not quite as good as soliciting and activating that network to receive from the network. So I think this is where I met you at the January 2020 gathering out in San Diego of about 150 really important people in my network that I was getting to know there. We watched Marshall Goldsmith and Alan Mullally, and Alan, as you mentioned, a dear friend, but also one of the greatest leaders of our generation, the former CEO of Ford and Boeing Commercial Aircraft. And I watched him across the course of an entire day teach us by modeling how he led those American icons through some incredible crises. So through 9/11, when two Boeing airplanes went right through the World Trade Center, and then in the Great Recession, when he was the CEO of Ford. And I knew that I wanted Alan to be part of my network. As I watched him, all I could think of was how can I ask him or bring him into my network and have him support me and maybe leveraging a couple of the principles and tools that he was using to manage Boeing and Ford. But, Alan's a very famous guy. Like why would he want to talk to me? So I'll pause there for a moment and I'll tell you the rest of the story about networking and making the ask.
No, and I think there's an important thing in there. It's not just about Alan, but it's about the ask. And it's a wonderful book by a colleague of mine, Wayne Baker, who says essentially the title is "Just Ask," and we need to do that, and it's important. But we want to put ourselves out there, and we're afraid of this rejection factor. So if you're thinking this, what's going through your mind? How do you steel yourself to? You're expecting a rejection, or what's going through your mind, Jennifer?
So again, this is where the networking and making the ask really link together. So where women are challenged when it's making the ask is we tend to ask equally, and this is research based, equally as much as men. But we tend to ask for the watered down version of what we think we can get, what will play well with the opposing party, whoever we're making the ask of, or worse, what we think we deserve. And more often than not, it is less or significantly less than what men are asking. So we can learn a lot from men here. That can, again, prevent us from taking action. So here's what happens. Inner critic plays a role in this story as well. I knew I wanted to meet Alan. I talked to our friend Marshall Goldsmith about, do you think Alan would be amenable to me, asking for support and his processes and working together management system, what I wanted access to. And Marshall very funnily said, I don't know. Why don't you ask him? So I was hoping Marshall would do it for me. So I was pondering this, and the next morning I woke up. It was like 5 a.m. because I was in San Diego, but I was on East Coast time, and I was working out in the gym. I was reading article after article on my iPad, and I thought I've got to find a way to make the ask and to secure Alan as part of my network. And so I stumble up in the Hyatt Regency where we were, up to the 17th floor where the Continental Breakfast Club was, and I stumble in to get a banana, and Alan is standing at the toaster by himself. Now, meanwhile, I'm all sweaty in my gym clothes, iPad in one hand, banana in another, and the inner critic just goes crazy. Like, you're not ready. You don't look good enough. You haven't prepared exactly what you were going to say. You should send him an email first. All of these things. And again, because I've been at this for a long time, I was able to notice the inner critic, pause, have a little compassion for myself, and then kind of get curious. Well, what's the worst thing that could happen? He's a very nice man. I mean, he'll reject me politely. So I did. I walked up to him and I made the ask. That's a whole nother story about how I did it and without thinking too much about it. And Alan, he gets asked a lot. And he just very thoughtfully said, you know, I'm interested in what you're saying. Can you send me an email and we'll take the next step? He didn't commit right away.
Yeah.
And then it was up to me. What do I need to do to get Alan interested enough to bring me into his network? So I'll pause there.
No, and that raises another question that you address. And it's akin to the idea of to say yes, you have to say no. And Alan gets many requests from many people for all kinds of things, as would you. So how do you deal with saying no before you say yes? So,
So you have hit on the biggest hurdle that women face, and it's called proving your value. Where women are, and again, it comes from kind of preconditioning through generations of put your head down, work hard, be seen and not heard. Prove yourself by working harder and harder. Say yes to everything, and we've kind of been told this growing up. From home to community to media to the corporate world. And I actually tell women all the time, I actually don't recommend that you say yes to everything. What women tend to do is we, put our head down and believe if we work harder and harder and harder, people will notice and we'll get the job, the promotion, the raise. Women tell me that all the time. My work speaks for itself. Like, really? That has not been my experience. So that's a whole nother hurdle around recognized confidence. But in terms of what we call proving your value, taking on more and more and more, whether it's at home or at work and in the community, and for women, it's usually all three of those things. What I recommend, and to answer your question, is once you have what I call clarity, and clarity is the second highest hurdle. So making the ask, clarity, and proving your value are the top three hurdles. When you have clarity about what you want. So if I were to ask you, John, if I were to look 2 years into the future, paint a picture of success for me. It doesn't have to be a job title or the amount of money you're making, but what are the skills, the strengths, the environment, the people, the relationships? Just take your career. Paint a picture for me, because when you're clear, I can help you get there. Most
right.
women will say, I don't have time to think about it, or nobody's ever asked me that before, or worse, if I put it out there and I don't get it, isn't it worse than saying nothing at all? So clarity helps you with what you say yes and what you say no to. And I have a 4-part framework that we can go into in a minute of how you do that if you're interested.
Yeah, I think it dovetails into the concept of negotiating because you had raised this before that women don't really ask for what they want or they settle for less. Most sadly often comes in source of income because men out earn women often, sadly, in the same jobs. So, what are some tips on this negotiating for what you really want, which I think is buttresses this concept of clarity? So,
Yeah. So we have a whole model in the book about how to do this well, but in general, first of all, experience and practice makes it less and less scary. And I talk about, as a private equity backed CEO, I have had so much practice now over the last 5 years making the ask that for me it's almost fun now, right? So whether it was my own compensation package to the recapitalization, the capital raise, the bonus structure for the executive team, the earnout as we sold the company, it just became easier with time. Now, I will say it's research backed as well. When women come hard with the ask and are told no, they tend to retreat further and faster than men. But more importantly, if they come back, they are often the recipients of backlash of her being too aggressive or too ambitious. And so that is an external bias that we have to work with our organizations and our executives to overcome. So as a side story, I had a head of talent acquisition in a keynote a couple weeks ago say, it's just so disheartening when men and women are negotiating for the same jobs. The men are always asking for more, and that's what's causing the salary disparity. And I said, and what is your role in fixing that? Right? You may be saving pennies on the dollar for the organization, but what's the downstream impact? So this is not all about women overcoming the hurdles on their own. They need their organizations. But what can we do as women? So first is make sure that you have a strong business case. And this is where I have so appreciated my network.
Yeah.
I was a first-time private equity-backed CEO. So I created a circle of advisors around me. So when I was doing all this negotiation, I knew it was grounded in data. The second thing was, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah. The second thing was to ensure that I was thoughtful about the who, the when, and the how. Do I need to be in person? Is this something that can happen via email? Is this something that should be bolted onto my performance review, which is what I tell a very funny story in the book of how I really got it wrong. I made the ask at the wrong time. and then finally, what's the relationship that you have, and how do you want to ensure that that relationship continues? So we have a model around how to do that very, very specifically, but there's nothing better than continuing to practice on lower stakes things to build your confidence on higher stakes things.
No, I'm glad you said that, because you led that off with in your role in running in a private equity firm, you had to ask lots of asks, and you got good at it. And it's more comfortable for you. And you just dovetailed with that. Practice makes perfect, really. Just hone your skills on it. Now, I'm going to ask you a really, maybe a controversial question, whatever. As many people who know me, I like to joke that if I were emperor of the world, I would turn everything over to women to manage and lead. And you have mentioned that so many of the allies for you, and I've heard this from so many successful women, are men. Now, there's a flip side of that, is some of the detractors of women leaders are women themselves. So have you encountered that? And when you do, what advice would you have, perhaps for a younger woman?
Yeah, it's a really important conversation. And there's actually two parts to the conversation. One, and I had this happen a month ago or so, someone came up to me after a keynote and said, "How come all of your examples on allyship, mentorship, sponsorship are men?" And it caused me to think. There actually are examples in the book with women as well, women as my sponsor. But the real reason is because there are more male leaders in senior positions of power. So you're likely to have more men than women when you get to a certain level, just because there's more of them out there. That's why I think it's so important to engage and embrace men in the solution, because we can't accelerate gender equity without the leadership majority, which 70% plus is still men and mostly white men. So it's very important to engage them really productively. And it's never about blaming or shaming, and more about engaging and supporting, them, especially if they're showing that they want to help. So your next question, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and so if I'm a young woman comes to you and said, my boss, who's a woman, is not supporting me, what do you say? What kind of advice do you give, Jennifer?
And so that's the second part of the question, which is women supporting women. And I feel actually really strongly about this, because for women, at least in the the Gen X and older, and I'm a Gen Xer, we were preconditioned as we rose the corporate ranks to believe that there's only room for one of us. And it was a really valid belief, because as we looked up, there were 0 or 1 everywhere we looked. We were always, and I still to this day am usually one of the only in the room. And so that mindset has carried forth, because most of the senior leadership majority are still Gen Xers. But as you look at this, and this kind of gets to your grace theme as well, I think as we move forward, this idea that I, as a Gen Xer, have a responsibility to lift as I climb and bring women with me. And if we're peers, or I have a woman boss, can we come to an understanding of not only grace, but also abundance? There's more leadership positions to be filled than there are men or women to fill them. So can we move beyond this scarcity mindset to this abundance mindset? And then,
Yeah.
and then third, if your boss is a woman and is a toxic leader that doesn't support you, I often say to younger women, you probably need to go to a place where you are celebrated and not tolerated. And it may be inside the organization under a different manager, man or woman, or it may be that you need to have a candid conversation and see if there's some misunderstanding.
Right. No, it's a good, solid advice, and I think and I like the way you tie this to this concept of abundance, because they're more pull up as you rise. One of the wonderful things about your book, in her own voice, is there are many, many models and things. So, and questions, self-questions. So this book has not just story and not just research, but some real tactical and practical things that you can do. So are you getting feedback from there on readers who tell you this, Jennifer? So.
Yeah, and so that's again going back to Sally Helgesen, and I think her name is Julia, but it's she
Yeah.
wrote When Women Lead, and Sally wrote
Yeah.
How Women Rise, and both of those books are fabulous. I've read them both. I think where they stop and we start, perhaps, is not only the storytelling, but then the very actionable guidance. And where we are unique at Linkage is that we've been doing that for 25 years through coaching and development and conferences and consulting. So we wanted to give in this book a taste of how to overcome each of the hurdles. And I'll give you an example. But it's important for women to be able to take the next step. It's also important for executives, men or women, to help coach and encourage and mentor women who are struggling with some of these hurdles. So to answer your question, I'm getting all kinds of fabulous feedback. It's early. The book just launched a few weeks ago about how the hurdles are resonating and the ability to take the next step. So you, for example, you gave we talked about the how to say no, or
Yes.
what you choose to say yes to. There's a very specific kind of 4-quadrant model that says, like, what can you do uniquely? And it aligns to your clarity. Only you can do that. What can you advise and consult? What can you completely delegate? And what can you say no to altogether because it doesn't align with what you have to do or what you want to do?
Making that, I think the specificity is very important, and that doesn't mean that these models or this book it's not a recipe book. I always advise, interpret it in your own way, but it gives you, to your theme, clarity. What do I want, defining myself, and what do I want? So that's a good shot.
My aspiration, and this was a surprise, I didn't expect this, but now my aspiration for the book, and it happened accidentally. A friend came up and said, I just bought 8 books. My entire family virtually is going to do a book club together, going through each chapter. Another one said, I just bought a dozen books for my team, and we're going to go through the book together. So this whole idea of, can this be used as, whether it's corporate or at home, book clubs, so that you can support each other in overcoming the hurdles, was a really nice surprise coming from the book.
Oh, that's great. Now, sadly, we are racing through this half hour. But as you know, Jennifer, I ask every guest a story about grace. Do you have one you'd like to share with us? So.
I do, and you may know her. Actually, her name is Susan Brady, and she was the founder of our Women in Leadership Institute way back in 1999. And she showed me a lot of grace when I became the CEO at Linkage, because honestly, I think that was her aspiration as well. And we found our way across the first year or so, where she was very gracious in accepting and supporting me as the CEO. But then she left the organization. She left to become her own CEO at another organization. And our private equity firm was not feeling so generous about, she had written a book and she'd started the Institute about kind of ongoing collaboration and cooperation with her. And my perspective, and again, I don't write about it in the book, but I would talk openly about it with her or the board, was this is a time for grace, right? She dedicated 20 years building up this institute. She wrote the last book 5 years ago that was the foundational book before in her own voice. And we need to offer her the grace of coming back to the Women in Leadership Institute even a year after she had left, honoring her from the stage, offering her opportunities to keynote as she transitioned and as we transitioned beyond her. She was a very pivotal executive at Linkage. And I think it was a story of her offering me grace when I landed the job, and then me offering her grace as she transitioned out.
I love that story because you were shown and you repaid it. And that's the story. That's what grace is. It is given to us, as our friend Sally Helgesen has said to me, no strings attached. we do with it what we want. And it's a wonderful story that you told about Susan. So, Jennifer, where can people find you and the book?
You can find the book anywhere. So would love for you to find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere you get your books, airports. But also, I would love it if you would follow me and connect with me on LinkedIn. It's Jennifer McCollum. And if you want to find out more about all of what we offer in Advancing Women Leaders, you can go to shrm.org. It's SHRM.org/in her own voice.
Great. Jennifer, you have been a wonderful guest. Good luck with In Her Own Voice. It is a good book. I recommend it. And with that, my friend, we will go out. So,
thank you, John.